Welcome to the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Every week, you'll hear strategies for building your online service-based business your way. And now, here's your host, veteran freelancer, author, and TEDx speaker, Laura Briggs.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. This episode is airing in the late summer, which is the perfect time to sort of recalibrate your business and look back on everything that's been accomplished during the past several months, all the months that have occurred since January. This is when I often do my analysis of what has gone well this far, how much money have I brought in, how close am I to my goals, and kind of looking at any other big picture issues that stand out to me, right? Am I working too many hours? Do I have clients on my roster I don't love working with? So before I dive into this week's podcast episode topic, I want to encourage you to think about those kinds of issues as you approach this part of the year. It's often harder to get clients to commit to calls until after Labor Day. There's usually a really busy period for freelancers that lasts from about after Labor Day to maybe the early to middle part of November. That's when we start to get into the holiday season. And you may see some scramble from people who are trying to wrap up projects, but most people aren't starting new retainer projects until January. So this end part of the summer is a great time to create new work samples, update your website, revise your LinkedIn profile. We have a podcast episode we will link in the show notes all about things you can do during the slow summer season. But I wanted to chat with you today about some of the things that I have experienced as a client hiring freelancers, and also the biggest complaints I have heard from my clients and other people in this industry. I end up in a lot of conversations with people who have at least tried to work with freelancers before, and I hear the same things over and over again. And these are the 4 biggest mistakes that freelancers make that are costing them business from freelance clients. And all of these really have responsibility that sits with you as the freelancer. So there are things to be mindful of and to think about how can you address or avoid these issues. Some of them are easily and completely avoidable and will make a big difference. So the first mistake that I see happening is when people take on way more than they can handle. So maybe you don't understand the full scope of the job, or you're not doing an onboarding or kickoff call. And so you end up realizing after taking on a project that you thought was relatively simple, that it's very involved. You kind of get overwhelmed. You can shut down. You may procrastinate on it because you don't feel comfortable that you understand everything to do with it. All of those things sort of don't necessarily get telegraphed to the client, right? So unless you tell them the reasons why you are feeling overwhelmed, then they're just thinking that you're not doing the work, that you don't care, that this isn't important to you. And I see this a lot with virtual assistants and online business managers. There's always a component of being a VA, a project manager, an OBM, a marketing strategist, where you need to rein in the client's expectations. So when you first start working with a client, you need to tell them how this process is going to work. Most people who are hiring a virtual assistant wait way too long to hire help. And so by the time they get somebody, they have this huge list of things that they just dump on their VA. And so it's not that it's your fault as the freelancer feeling super overwhelmed and that you've taken on more than you can handle, but it's that you kind of didn't set expectations with the client up front. So you might tell them, hey, let's start off with 1 or 2 simple projects, or 5 hours a week, or this is what my process is going to look like as your copywriter. I'm going to take a look at everything that's on your existing page, and I'm going to come up with a list of suggestions. That tells the client that you're not going to be able to dive in and go at 110% right away. If you're like me, it usually takes me about 2 weeks to get grounded with a new client. You're going to make mistakes during that period. You're not going to have access to things. There's going to be more revisions. They're not going to give you all the instructions or details you need. So it's going to feel a little bit messy. And your goal then is to kind of grab control of that and look for ways to streamline it. If you've got the client who's texting you or sending you too many emails, you want to try to get them on project management software as soon as possible. But taking on more than you can handle, even when it's not your fault that the client's expectations are off, if you're not communicating that back to them, they just think that you're lazy, that you're a procrastinator, that you're disorganized. And so don't take on more than you can handle. And if someone comes to you with a project that feels very vague, respond to them honestly and say, hey, I need more details. Let's do a 30-minute call so I can get a really good understanding of what you want and figure out if it's the right thing. I recently helped a client of mine hire her very first online business manager, and her expectations were not aligned with what she was, one, willing to pay, and two, had scoped out in the job description. She was starting to mesh things like advanced social media management and copywriting in with a general virtual assistant. So as the person helping her recruit, it was my job to kind of help her walk that back and say, all right, you are going to set this person up to fail because, one, finding somebody that has all of these skill sets and is 10 out of 10 in all of them is nearly impossible. But then let's say you do find them, you're going to overload them and you're going to give them more than they can handle. So if a project feels too big or if a client's expectations are totally unrealistic, you need to tell them and you kind of need to figure out what the structure of that would look like for it to work for you. A lot of times they're going to respond to that positively because part of the reason they're outsourcing is they feel the chaos, they feel the disorganization. And the moment that you step in and sort of go, okay, yep, this is a mess, but I can help you with it. And here's how that's going to work. You kind of put their fears at ease. So that's number one, taking on more than you can handle. The second thing is it blows my mind how often this happens, but it happens a lot. It happens a lot with writers. It happens a lot with virtual assistants. I see it more with those two categories than, say, like a graphic designer who's doing a full mock-up or a website designer not doing things right or doing them sloppily. And this has happened to me so many times that it is like, it's very frustrating as a client because you start to doubt whether or not you're even good at recruiting and onboarding people. There has been a project that I only recently fixed after hiring two different people to do it, and it was not done properly either time, and it was done really sloppily, and it took really long. I mean, this was not a really complex project. It was something that ended up taking one person around 3 hours to finish, but other people were spending 5, 10 hours, 3 weeks working on it, and it just wasn't done right. And a big pet peeve of clients is when you make a mistake as a freelancer and you don't own up to it. If you submit something that has typos in it and a client calls you on it, just apologize and move on. If you can't get to a project because something came up in your life, or even if that happened and then you didn't communicate with the client about why something was going to be delayed, the best thing you can do in that moment is to course correct and be honest. But not doing it right and doing it sloppily and turning that in and hoping your client won't notice, those are things that are really frustrating for clients, and they're not going to want to work with you again and again, because as a client, it feels like, wow, I'm still dealing with this project. I'm still dealing with this issue. My project that I was working on this year almost became a joke because it was like, why is this taking 3 months to finish this? Like, obviously it's not meant to be. It's never going to be finished, because it was like the project that kept haunting me. I kept trying to outsource it. It kept failing, but not doing it right or doing it sloppily. Some of that can get back to that first mistake of taking on more than you can handle, or you're stepping into a new service area and you haven't encountered this situation before. Again, honesty is key here. Come back to the client and say, listen, I'm hitting a snag I've never hit before. I've gone ahead and contacted customer support, or I reached out to an expert in the field, or I was watching a YouTube tutorial last night to figure out how to fix it. Show some initiative in your willingness to want to fix it or figuring it out if you can. But not doing something right and doing it sloppily, there's simply no excuse for those things, right? If you get into a project and you realize you're in over your head, or it's more complex than the client positioned it to be, again, go back to them and have that conversation and say, hey, you told me this was simply just updating some plugins on your website. Well, I logged into WordPress and I found out it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And it's beyond the skill set that I have. Here's the parts I can help with. And here's what I recommend you outsource to XYZ freelancer if you want to address all of those things. So don't do things sloppily. I tell this story often. I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in Six Figure Freelancer. I hired an online business manager years ago who was being paid a very hefty retainer, about $1,500 a month. I had to sign to work with her for a full 3-month period. Every single thing she turned in was done sloppily. I could tell that it was rushed. Dates were wrong, links were wrong. I always had to go back and redo the entire thing myself. And I've never had as bad of an experience as that, as I actually said, I don't even want to finish the 3 months. Like, if you want to hold me to that contract, that's fine. But I don't even want you working on my projects anymore. And thankfully she handled it professionally and just said, no, I'm going to let you out of the contract and you're not going to have to pay the remainder. But it was like, what was the point of that whole experience, going through recruiting somebody, hiring them, training them, only for them to do everything sloppily? You can't get mad if you're losing clients for that reason. You need to be organized. You need to be willing to troubleshoot. And I get that that's a very hard line to walk, right? Especially anytime you're in a role as a strategist or a consultant, and you kind of have to go back and forth between doing deliverables and giving them advice or giving them suggestions. So the third issue that is honestly probably the biggest one for most clients, and it is amazing how often it comes up: not communicating, being rude, or ghosting the client. I always tell clients who come to me to help them hire freelance writers that you can expect that approximately, like, let's say you hire 10 writers, 3 of them will just disappear and you'll never hear from them again. Unfortunately, ghosting can happen both ways, right? You can have clients who ghost you. I see people talk about this with their Upwork projects. I have a client right now on Upwork where the guy literally just never responded after hiring me. And so it's like, I'm not really sure what you wanted me to do because it's been sitting there for 10 days and, there's no project to work on right now. But ghosting your clients or not communicating with them makes them question everything about their decision, not just to hire you, but to outsource, period. They become very distrusting. And so then that's a trait that follows them into hiring other freelancers. A lot of us freelancers have dealt with this where our clients come to us and they've had a bad experience. They can easily tell you the most burned they ever felt by a freelancer because it's so common. So I had an issue with someone on my team who was just sort of brought in for a smaller project and, kind of talked to somebody else who was an existing member of the team and had been there for a long time in a way that almost was borderline rude. And so just that reason alone, I was like, I told this person who'd worked with me forever, that is enough of a reason for us to be able to say this is just not a fit, right? Because we're not going to throw off the whole team dynamic by this one person who's kind of out of alignment with everything else we're trying to do here as far as communication. Ghosting your clients, that's never responding to them. I just talked to another new client last week who said, I've got 2 writers that I'll literally give them assignments and they won't email me at all, whether they've accepted it or not. She's like, I just can't plan my editorial calendar not knowing that. So lack of communication is a huge issue for clients. Just becoming a better communicator will make your clients happier because they know what to expect, right? So understanding where you are in that process and how you can make communication easy all starts at the beginning of that relationship. How do they get in touch with you? How often will you give them updates? Are you sending them a weekly report? Are you putting together a Trello board where they can always see the status of the project and where it's at? Are there other elements where it's going to make it easy to handle communication? If you are behind, if you get sick, if something comes up in your life, if your computer dies, if whatever happens, tell the client. Don't just tell them, hey, I'm delayed, but tell them what this means for them. Hey, I'm delayed because my computer crashed today. I've got a loaner that will be delivered here tomorrow. So it looks like I'm just going to be about 10 hours behind on delivery or whatever the update is. They just want to know. Most clients are not dealing with urgent projects, but they do want to know what is going on. And I think a big part of the reason that this non-communication happens is because a lot of freelancers procrastinate and they wait too long to start the project, which is really problematic because then they're too late in getting the project off the ground. And then they're rushing or they realize, they've put this project that's due on a Friday at 5 p.m. They haven't started it until Friday at 11 a.m. and they realize they have a headache that day, or it's more involved than they thought, or they don't have everything they need to execute. And a client can tell when you go to them and say, hey, by the way, I'm not going to meet this deadline today. You literally just started it, right? If you're sending it on the same day it's due and you're asking questions or you can't access the files, they know you've just started it. And should have come to them much sooner. So always review your instructions when you get them from clients. And the fourth one, I don't know, it could be a tie, between not communicating and this one. This one is so obvious that I tell it to every new freelancer I meet. Many, many relationships with freelancers and clients fall apart due to delivering after the deadline. I had a new client last week tell me that she has 2 freelancers on her roster who consistently deliver late to the tune of 2 weeks. So I'm not talking about 5 minutes or the next business day, 2 weeks. And she said, this is so frustrating. It's so hard for me to keep track of everything or to know if I'm ever going to receive the finished work at all. So it's your job as a freelancer to push back against a deadline if a client gives you one that is unreasonable. It's your job to say, that's not realistic, or I'm already booked through most of next week, or yeah, I'm going to need more time. I know you think this will only take an hour. It actually takes around 5. Reset their expectations and always give yourself a minimum of a buffer half day. I love a buffer whole day if you can do it. But if the client says, I need this by Friday morning, you give yourself that extra buffer half day in your own schedule in case something comes up, right? That gives you a little bit of flexibility for unforeseen events. And in the best case scenario, you deliver early. I like to joke with a lot of my experienced freelance writer friends that half the reason we are in business is just because other people don't deliver by a deadline. Missing deadlines is something that should happen only occasionally and usually due to some type of unpredictable emergency. If it becomes a regular occurrence, your finished work may be great. The client might love you otherwise. But just like we decide who not to work with because there's aspects of that relationship that are frustrating for us from a logistics perspective, your clients can feel the same way. So these are 4 things that I hear constantly from clients, and I have seen as a client hiring freelancers myself. It is your job to not just do the work. I think a lot of this goes back to the thinking of, well, this will be easy. This is just a project I can take on. I get to work from home. I can work on it whenever I want. And you miss that professionalism aspect of the rest of it, of needing to rise to the occasion, of delivering the service or the final deliverable to the client, but also an excellent client experience. They want to feel like you're communicating. They want to feel like your word means something, that you're going to deliver when you say you're going to deliver, and that you're going to push back or speak up if something is unclear or they have unrealistic expectations. So thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. If you are a new listener to this show and you're feeling inspired to launch your freelance business because you're like, I don't do any of these things and I will be super successful by launching my business and knowing all of this before I start, you can check out my free report on the top 24 most profitable freelance side hustles to start in 2021 and 2022. That is at betterbizacademy.com/side hustle.